In August of 2022, Danish filmmaker Lars von Trier revealed his Parkinson's diagnosis to the world. And last week, in February 2025, his production company announced he'd been admitted to a care facility in Denmark due to the inevitable progression of the disease. As a fan, I did what any rational person would do. I scrapped my weekend plans, I locked my front door, and I spread his DVDs across my bed like a shell-shocked teenager. About an hour later, I posted a community poll asking my subscribers to pick between Antichrist, Dancer in the Dark, and the house that Jack built. And when Jack won by a surprisingly wide margin, for a moment I thought I'd gotten off easy. All three films are dense and challenging, but Antichrist has scenes I sometimes can't even look at. Dancer in the Dark stars one of my favorite creative powerhouses in Bjork, but at times her performance in that movie is just as hard to sit through as Antichrist. I've seen the house that Jack built maybe a half dozen times since it came out in 2018, but I have never watched it with the intention of analyzing it. Watching it through a critical eye for the first time last week, something I'd never picked up on before dawned on me going into the final act, and I think it's something significant. So, today, I am sharing my raw notes from that first viewing. They won't sound polished or particularly intelligent, but given the circumstances and knowing now this might be von Trier's final film, I figured the least I can do to honor a man who's always spoke candidly and from the heart is to do the same myself. So the movie opens with Jack asking Virgil if he's allowed to talk during the journey they're about to take together, and Virgil tells him to go ahead, but reminds him that no matter what he says, Virgil has heard it all before. So immediately we know we're starting at the end of this story because von Trier's Virgil is about to guide Jack through the 9 circles of hell, just like the ancient Roman poet Virgil did in the Divine Comedy. So von Trier's using the first section of Dante Allegory's 14th century epic as a structural framework, meaning Jack wants to explain how he ended up eternally damned in his own words. And what we're about to watch is presented as 5 incidents spanning 12 years of Jack's life. The first incident introduces a nameless woman stranded at the side of the road, played perfectly by Uma Thurman. As she flags Jack down for help, take note, his van is painted the exact same shade of red as her broken tire jack. Jack isn't interested in helping, but she's so pushy and insistent, eventually she forces him to take her up the road to a blacksmith. And the instant she gets into the van, she starts taunting him and joking that getting into the van was a mistake because he looks like a serial killer. Once they're at the blacksmith, she insists again that he waits on her. And when he checks on the progress, the blacksmith describes her exactly as Jack sees her, as pushy and relentless. Once the jack's been welded, she demands a ride back, and she doubles down on her serial killer accusations, only this time she spells out exactly how he could kill her with the jack and where he could dispose of the body, before backpedaling eventually and mocking him for being too wimpy to do anything at all. And that is when her verbal abuse causes Jack to snap. Or does it? Now, if you don't catch what just actually happened in this first incident, the rest of the movie is going to feel disjointed. Remember I said Jack's going to tell us how he ended up eternally damned in his own words? What you've just seen, and what you're going to continue to see, is Jack recalling things as he sees them. He's a very exaggerated example of an unreliable narrator because Jack is a psychopath, and he just recounted this incident the way a psychopath would. Everything's always somebody else's fault. Lady's dialogue feels insane because it is. And that's because Jack sees himself as the victim of the woman. And she has no name in this movie's credits because Jack didn't give her one. She doesn't matter to him. Then von Trier cuts immediately to archival footage of Glenn Gould, the famous Canadian pianist, because this is Jack's recollection and Jack sees what he did to the woman as being art. Jack's likening himself to one of the most celebrated pianists of the 20th century. Now, by way of comparison, this is obviously grandiose and absurd. What's important here, though, is Virgil's reaction to the comparison, which is laughter and head shaking. Jack is an engineer by trade, but he's always dreamed of being an architect, and one day he intends to build a remarkable and iconic house. Throughout the film, we revisit the plot of land where this supposed masterpiece will eventually stand, except every time we go there, he's in the process of tearing it down to start over again. And once again, after Jack talks about this house he's going to build, Virgil laughs, because from his perspective, Jack's nothing more than a man with obsessive-compulsive disorder in the middle of an episode. And because psychopaths can't face the truth, Jack immediately changes the subject when Virgil starts laughing. And he talks about a building he just recently purchased with a big walk-in freezer. In very typical Von Trier fashion, the director subtly foreshadows Jack's eventual fate with the building's location on Prospect Avenue. Prospect meaning the likelihood of some future event occurring, and avenue meaning a way of making progress towards something. Von Trier is telling us Jack is doomed with that street sign, but we won't fully understand why until later on. Jack dumps the woman's body in his freezer, and then he goes to check out the only door in the building he was never able to open. And what do you know? I bet you recognize the shade of that window frame. And as he's maniacally scrubbing the blood from his van, Virgil tells him outright, "You're a fucking neurotic riddled with obsessive compulsions and a pathetic dream of something greater." Jack ends this first incident by recalling how he dumped the woman's car in the forest only to realize it was still visible from the main road. But then it dawned on him he left it just over the state line, making it essentially invisible to the local police. And he calls that an act of accidental genius, which is very revealing. Jack spots his next random victim, except we know there's nothing random about it because we in the audience are now subconsciously responding to the film's use of color symbolism. He follows the woman home posing as a police officer, and after spotting her shopping bag, he pretends he's investigating something relating to the shopping mall she just visited. When she asks to see his badge, he fumbles for an excuse, and it's so unconvincing, it's actually kind of cringy to watch. And then, after noticing a memorial to her late husband on the wall behind her, he changes his story. Now he says he's an insurance agent who can guarantee her twice the widow's pension she's currently receiving. And after that half-assed effort, she lets him in. Just like that. Now, of course, if you untangle his perspective from the recollection, in reality, Jack is simply insulting this woman's intelligence by suggesting he got in so easily. Once he's inside, after Jack has a brief self-centered outburst about how she's inconvenienced him by making him stand outside, he kills her. It takes several awkward, hard-to-watch attempts, but eventually he does get the job done. And afterwards, he takes things a step further, reinforcing his connection to the color red, the exact same shade of red you've already seen. And as this is his retelling, you will notice this is a second woman who essentially asked for it. As Jack suffers from obsessive-compulsive disorder, he can't resist the thought he might have left blood somewhere in the room, so he returns several times to clean up, and this compulsive revisiting mirrors Norman Bates in Psycho, 1960, arguably the most iconic serial killer in film history. The confidence he gained from the first murder is carrying over. He's not even fazed by the approaching police sirens. In fact, he starts looking for trouble by talking his way back inside with the responding officer and arrogantly pointing out how spotless the place is. He's daring the authorities to catch him, and when they don't, his ego swells. So much so that he drags the woman's body through the middle of the town tied to the back of his van. As this unfolds, David Bowie's Fame plays. I can't play it for you here for copyright reasons, but it's worth noting the lyrics. Fame makes a man take things over. Fame lets him lose, hard to swallow. Fame puts you there where things are hollow. The lyrics spell things out pretty clearly, but what's less obvious here is Von Trier's sleight of hand. If you find yourself singing along or even enjoying the song in this moment, congratulations. You've just given Jack permission to keep going. You are complicit, and I will explain why in a moment. When Jack returns to the freezer, an unexpected rain shower washes away his bloody tracks, and once again he's eluded capture, not because of his skill, but because of dumb luck. You cannot plan the weather. This prompts Virgil to finally ask Jack directly if he's accepted the reality that he's a psychopath. Jack responds by holding up a series of signs in a sequence mirroring during Bob Dylan's highly iconic Subterranean Homesick Blues video. Jack's signs read vulgarity and rudeness and impulsiveness and narcissism and intelligence and irrationality and manipulation and mood swings and verbal superiority. And then, as if it's the most normal thing in the world, he tells Virgil he used to practice facial expressions in the mirror in hopes of fitting in better. Jack then recalls a childhood memory. He used to hide in the tall reeds to get away from people, but Virgil challenges him immediately, pointing out the clear trail of broken reeds he left behind him suggests he actually always wanted to be found. Jack ignores the observation and admits he's amazed at how many terrible things he's done without ever being punished. That brings us to one of the film's most visually stunning sequences as Jack recalls the men in his village cutting the fields with scythes. On the surface, it's a beautiful cinematic moment, but Von Trier is using it to symbolize the dual nature of life. The sown grass grows only to be reaped, eventually and inevitably. Creation and destruction go hand in hand. Then comes one of the film's most controversial moments when young Jack snaps a duckling's leg off with pliers. It looks remarkably realistic, but obviously it's not. Jack then claims the more murders he commits, the less his OCD affects him. He essentially finds comfort in killing. And as he's driving home, in his next recollection, he passes a random woman walking home along a dark road. She commits a very subtle sin within this film's framework, so Jack does a U-turn, adding her to his growing collection of corpses. And once again, fame plays. Only this time, there's a shift. Jack leaves all the blood in the van. He no longer feels the need to clean up after himself. In other words, his arrogance is blossoming. Jack's third incident takes place on a hunting trip with a single mother and her 2 young sons, and he recalls it as his attempt at family. For safety reasons, Jack insists everyone wears a red hat. At this point in the story, we don't need to be told this connects Jack's violence to each of the family members. Jack launches into a long, detailed rant about his disdain for hunting, complete with historical references to the sport's evolution, and then without hesitation, he picks off the kids one by one. Then he forces the mother to sit and eat lunch with their corpses before finishing her off as well. And if you're a fan of film, this scene might remind you of The Deer Hunter from 1978, more specifically De Niro's iconic red bandana. In the fourth incident, Jack recalls Jacqueline, a woman he claims he once loved, played by Riley Keough. When she opens the door, she can't look him in the eye because when he looks at her, it makes her feel horrible. So he picks up a phone from the other room so they can talk without looking at each other. With this, the phone becomes a visual cue linking Jack's violence to Jacqueline. In doing so, it evokes Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line from 1998, which is one of cinema's most haunting depictions of war and brutality, also considered iconic by cinephiles. And once he's got her smiling again, the manipulation kicks in. He starts calling her simple and berating her with every sentence. And at times, it is as hard to watch as the duckling scene. Hats off to the actors for that. When he's broken her down enough, he forces her to fetch a marker so he can outline where he plans on cutting off her breasts. And at first, she thinks he's joking, till she realizes he's not. When she runs outside to a passing police officer, Jack follows and casually admits he is a serial killer while pretending to be sorry for how he's treated her. The cop, seeing nothing out of the ordinary, drives away. I'd point out the parallels between this scene and the real-life events of Jeffrey Dahmer, but there's nothing iconic about him. Back inside, Jacqueline tries to sneak out, only to find the phone lines cut and the doors locked. She screams at the top of her lungs, and Jack screams along with her, once again proving that no matter how hard he tries, he can't get in trouble. Then he cuts her apart and leaves half of the evidence on the cop's windshield. For his fifth and final incident, Jack sets his sights on a grand gesture, taking out an entire row of men with a single Full Metal Jacket bullet, a direct homage to Stanley Kubrick's uber-iconic Full Metal Jacket from 1987. But there's a problem. One of the men points out the bullet he's holding isn't actually full metal. And that sends Jack into a rage, and he storms off to an ammunition store only to be denied because he doesn't have ID. So he turns to a friend who also keeps bullets at home. But when he arrives arrives, the friend pulls a gun on him because the police were there the day before looking for Jack. His friend phones the police, but as always, Jack charms his way out of the situation, and once again he gets away, this time by draping his friend's signature red cloak over his head, tricking the police into mistaking one for the other. Back in the freezer, Jack prepares to take the shot, but realizes he's too close to the men to focus his scope. So, he finally pushes open the door that never opens. And I believe this marks the moment of Jack's death, because Virgil speaks to him, and that brings us back to where the movie opened. It's now time for them to start their journey into hell. It's also time for me to start lifting the veil. Virgil reminds Jack he never figured out how to build his iconic house, so before they leave, he encourages Jack to finally put the materials he's gathered to use, and he does. This moment deepens the Norman Bates parallels. Jack is obsessed with mummified bodies, and now, like Norman Bates, he's been caught. As Jack enters the house, the police burst in behind them. I believe they'd already shot him, and what we're seeing now is his final vision, or the aftermath. Then he and Virgil vanish into a hole in the floor, ushering in the epilogue. Catabasis refers to the final stage of a protagonist's journey when that protagonist's journey ends in the underworld. Jack's underworld journey begins in the water, symbolizing his soul crossing the river Styx. Eventually, he and Virgil reach a pit leading to the ninth circle, or the center of hell. This section's heavily stylized and visually stunning, but it's more window dressing than anything meaningful at the moment. As they descend, the temperature drops quickly. The deeper they go, the more red dominates the screen. Jack's crimson housecoat serves as a final reminder Von Trier is directly paralleling Dante's journey into hell, as it visually echoes the Bark of Dante, Eugene Delacroix's iconic painting, which also explores themes of self-confrontation and the acknowledgement of personal sin. Then Jack sees the men with the scythes, and he pauses, and he reflects. As his entire life flashes before his eyes, a single tear rolls down his cheek. Too little, too late. They eventually reach the deepest pits of hell, where a broken bridge spans the molten chasm. Jack's ultimate destination is a few levels up, but Virgil thought he might like to see everything. Then Jack spots a staircase on the other side, which is a way out of hell. Virgil warns him nobody has ever made it, but reminds Jack it's entirely his choice. Now, we know Jack screwed everything up in this story, but his ego won't let him back down. He believes he will be the first. And when he inevitably fails, he makes things so much worse for himself as he plummets into the hellfire for eternity. And in that moment, Von Trier shows us exactly how he felt 7 years earlier. At the Cannes Festival, he wanted to entertain the crowd, and instead his fragile, splintered personality led him to be despised by his peers and shunned from public life, like a serial killer.
No, I was in a fairly good mood, and then I have this terrible tendency to want to entertain a crowd, which is extremely stupid. And then I expressed things that with more words could be understandable, but with little words were, of course, extremely stupid.
I believe the house that Jack built is an allegory for Lars von Trier's own life, particularly after the events of 2011, when he claimed to understand elements of Adolf Hitler in a poorly worded attempt at humor. His contemporaries and the media crucified him for it. I believe von Trier expresses his thoughts through Jack in this film. When it's viewed through that lens, the story becomes deeply personal. Jack's dream of building an iconic house mirrors von Trier's lifelong pursuit of cinematic greatness. He wants to be remembered. He wants his work to have meant something. Throughout the film, von Trier floods the screen with cultural icons, making it clear he's examining iconography through film. That is no coincidence. In real life, von Trier hired renowned Danish architect Bjarke Ingels to design Jack's macabre dwelling, specifically because of his extensive portfolio of iconic buildings. Von Trier, like Jack, suffers from obsessive-compulsive disorder, and he has openly spoken about what he considers to be his own psychopathic tendencies. If you replace Virgil's voice with Von Trier's own inner critic, the parallels become even stronger. Every time Jack suggests he's creating something great, Virgil reminds him of cold reality. Do you remember what Virgil called him? You're a fucking neurotic riddled with obsessive compulsions and a pathetic dream of something greater. How's that for self-esteem? Not exactly what you would attribute to one of Hollywood's biggest directors, is it? By layering catchy music over Jack's horrific crimes, Von Trier implicates you in the audience. Despite all the accusations and controversies surrounding his career, he has still built a devoted following of people who admire his art, regardless of the moral debate surrounding it. Jack's repeated accidental escapes suggest Von Trier sees his own success as a series of lucky breaks, or the result of decisions made in the moment without knowing if they were truly the right ones. When Jack suggests murder quiets his OCD, Von Trier is telling us that filmmaking gives him that same sense of calm. No matter how reckless or obvious Jack was in his crimes, he could never get caught. Maybe that's Von Trier's way of implying the industry failed to call him out. And when Jack stopped cleaning up after himself, that's Von Trier admitting his success convinced him he was on the right path and perhaps invincible. At its core, while this movie explores what it takes to make iconic art, it is also an exploration of art and morality, and that's why it ends in hell. Von Trier's telling us at times he let his success justify some of his more questionable behaviors with people he worked with. At Cannes, he wanted to entertain the audience, but he's never been good with interacting with people on that level, so he fucked it up. He brings that sentiment to life through Jack, practicing emotions in the mirror, trying to imitate what he can't naturally understand himself. Perhaps that final tear at the window is Von Trier realizing it all too late. That makes him sad. If you dig deep enough, you can trace every aspect of this film back to Von Trier himself. For example, Jack inherited a large sum of money which allowed him to live freely and pursue his art. Von Trier's films are funded. His money is handed to him. At the start of this video, I mentioned noticing something last week I'd never seen before in this movie. As I sat there cross-eyed, drawing all these parallels over several days, something dawned on me as I looked up at my screen. The title, The House That Jack Built. This film's named after an old English nursery rhyme. So what? The poem's repetitive, and it's fun to say, and they used to use it to teach young children language skills. But it's also completely meaningless. It has no hidden depth or symbolism. It can even be seen as a metaphor for the consequences of building something too complicated without thinking about the final product. That left me wondering, have we all just been trolled by Von Trier? Or is he suggesting that after a lifetime of filmmaking, he failed to build the iconic house he always dreamed of? No point during this story did Jack apologize for everything he'd done. You can even interpret the final images to support that idea. The symbolic red I've been yammering about symbolizes Jack's propensity for violence. So is he wrapping himself in red at the end in acceptance of his fate? Was he asking forgiveness with the single tear? Is he dismantling his own mythology with this movie? Or is he laughing at me for overanalyzing everything? If Virgil represents Von Trier's inner voice, and Virgil allowed Jack to fall to an eternity in fire, is Lars telling us he knew he was doomed all along? I don't know, but I do want to know what you think. If you've seen The House That Jack Built, I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments section. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, folks.